Keanu Reeves has faced many challenges throughout his career, but what happened at LAX private terminal that spring afternoon in 2025 would test his character in ways no one expected. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a celebrity encounter gone wrong. It's about a moment that changed multiple lives forever, sparked a movement within the aviation industry, and showed how one person's response to discrimination could ripple out to touch thousands of lives. This is the untold story of how Keanu Reeves turned an ugly incident of prejudice into a force for lasting change. If you want to see how Keanu transforms this moment of discrimination into an opportunity for change, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. This story of courage, compassion, and positive change is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Los Angeles International Airport's private terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Keanu Reeves adjusted the strap of his well-worn backpack, his boots making soft sounds against the marble as he approached the security checkpoint. He'd made this walk countless times before, but today felt different. Marcus Chen, his longtime assistant, walked a few steps behind him, coordinating last-minute details for their flight to Vancouver where filming for John Wick, Chapter 5 was scheduled to begin. Keanu's mind wandered to the script revisions he'd been reviewing earlier, until the sharp voice of the security guard snapped him back to reality. "Hold it right there," the guard commanded, his hand raised. The name tag on his pristine uniform read Davidson. His face wore an expression that Keanu had seen before, though rarely in recent years, that subtle mix of prejudice and presumption that made his stomach tighten. Keanu stopped, maintaining his characteristic calm. "Good afternoon," he said quietly, reaching for his identification. Davidson's eyes narrowed, scanning Keanu's casual attire, black jeans, a well-loved leather jacket, and his signature beanie. "This is the private aviation terminal," he stated, emphasis heavy on the word private. "I think you might be lost." Marcus stepped forward, documents in hand. "This is Keanu Reeves. We have a scheduled departure." "I wasn't talking to you," Davidson cut him off, never taking his eyes off Keanu. "Sir, if you're looking for the main terminal, it's back that way." He gestured dismissively toward the exit. The few other travelers in the terminal had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Keanu could feel their eyes, could sense phones being pulled out discreetly. Had spent decades in the public eye, learned to handle attention both positive and negative, but this felt personal in a way that made his chest tighten. He took a slow, deliberate breath, remembering his mother's words from years ago, "How you handle the hard moments defines who you are." The security guard's prejudice was clear, a toxic mix of racial bias and assumptions about what a movie star should look like. Keanu's hand, still holding his ID, remained steady. He could feel Marcus tensing beside him, ready to escalate the situation to supervisors. But something inside him knew there was a better way to handle this, a way that might actually make a difference. "You know what?" Keanu said softly, a gentle smile touching his lips. "You're right. I am lost." He paused, watching confusion flicker across Davidson's face. "I get lost all the time, actually. Lost in thoughts about how we judge each other, lost in wondering why we let fear make our decisions for us. But maybe we can find our way together?" The terminal had grown quiet, the afternoon sun painting everything in amber tones as this unexpected moment unfolded. It was about to become more than just another celebrity encounter, it was about to become a lesson in humanity that none of them would soon forget. Time seemed to slow in that moment as Keanu stood facing Davidson, the security guard's words hanging heavy in the air between them. In his 30-plus years in Hollywood, Keanu had experienced discrimination before, the subtle sideways glances, the assumptions about his mixed heritage, the way some people still couldn't quite accept his place in the industry. But this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. As he stood there, memories flickered through his mind like scenes from an old film reel. He remembered his mother, Patricia, telling him stories about their Chinese-Hawaiian heritage, teaching him to be proud of who he was. He thought about his father, Samuel, and the complex relationship with his own mixed background. These thoughts weren't filled with anger, but with a deep understanding of the generational weight they carried. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside him, and Keanu could sense his assistant's growing frustration. Around them, the hushed whispers of onlookers grew, phones still discreetly recording. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Is that really Keanu Reeves?" While another voice whispered, "I can't believe this is happening." But Keanu's mind was elsewhere, processing the situation with the same thoughtful intensity he brought to his craft. He thought about the young Asian American actors he'd mentored, the stories they'd shared about similar experiences. He thought about all the kids who might watch those phones recordings later, learning either that prejudice wins or that there's a better way to respond. His heart rate had quickened, but not from anger. It was the familiar surge of adrenaline he felt before important scenes, when something real and meaningful was about to happen. Davidson's stance remained rigid, his expression a mask of authority and prejudice, but Keanu saw something else too. In the guard's eyes, he recognized fear, the kind that often lay at the root of such behavior. The weight of the moment pressed on him. He could feel the industry connections in his phone that could end this man's career with a single call. He could sense the social media storm that would erupt if he chose to share this story. The power to destroy was there, readily available, but that wasn't who Keanu was. That wasn't who he wanted to be. Instead, his mind drifted to something his Bill and Amp, TED co-star, Alex Winter, had once said during a deep conversation: "The hardest part isn't standing up to your enemies, it's finding the compassion to help them become your friends." A sense of calm settled over him as his path became clear. This wasn't about winning or losing, about power or pride. This was about transformation, the kind that could only happen when someone chose to break the cycle of prejudice with understanding. Keanu felt his lips curve into a small, genuine smile. He had played many heroes on screen, but real heroism, he knew, wasn't about fighting back. It was about fighting for something better. And in this moment, with everyone watching, he had the chance to demonstrate exactly what that meant. The late afternoon sun continued to paint long shadows across the terminal floor, but Keanu no longer felt its weight. Instead, he felt light, purposeful, ready. He was about to show everyone present that the most powerful response to prejudice isn't confrontation, it's connection. He shifted his backpack, squared his shoulders, and took a step forward. What happened next would surprise everyone in that terminal, including Davidson himself. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act isn't standing your ground, it's extending your hand to help someone else find theirs. "Let's start over," Keanu said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had won over countless film crews throughout his career. He deliberately tucked his ID back into his pocket, a move that made Davidson's eyebrows rise. "I'm Keanu. And you're," he gestured to the name tag, "Officer Davidson. Mind if I call you by your first name?" The guard's stance remained rigid. "That's not protocol, sir." "Protocol," Keanu repeated thoughtfully, as if tasting the word. "You know, I've been thinking about protocols lately. Especially while preparing for John Wick. There's this scene where my character has to choose between following protocol and doing what's right." He paused, noting how Davidson's expression flickered at the movie reference. Sometimes the hardest protocols to break are the ones we create in our own minds. A few feet away, Marcus had pulled out his phone, presumably to call airport management, but Keanu subtly waved him off. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones still recording, but Keanu maintained his focus entirely on Davidson. "How long have you worked here?" Keanu asked, his tone genuinely curious. Davidson's jaw tightened. 7 years. 7 years. That's dedication. Must have seen a lot of different people come through these doors. "Look," Davidson started, his voice carrying an edge of frustration, "in just doing my job. This area is for verified private aviation passengers only. And you're protecting it," Keanu completed the thought. "That's important work. Keeping people safe." He took another step forward, but this time it wasn't confrontational. "You know what I've learned after 30 years in the public eye? The hardest person to protect ourselves from is often ourselves. Our own prejudices, our own fears." The terminal had grown so quiet you could hear the distant rumble of jets taking off. Davidson's stance had shifted almost imperceptibly, the aggressive authority in his posture beginning to crack. "I have my ID right here," Keanu continued, patting his pocket. "Could show it to you, prove who I am. But that wouldn't address the real reason we're having this conversation, would it?" For the first time, Davidson's eyes wavered, dropping briefly to the floor before meeting Keanu's gaze again. "Here's what I propose," Keanu said, reaching slowly into his backpack. He pulled out a worn copy of the script he'd been reviewing earlier. "I have about an hour before my flight. Why don't we grab a coffee from that kiosk over there? You can tell me about your 7 years here, and maybe we can read through a scene together. I could use the practice." The shock on Davidson's face was visible. That's not protocol?" Keanu smiled. "Maybe not. But sometimes the best moments in life happen when we step outside the lines we've drawn for ourselves." A long moment passed. The onlookers held their breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, Davidson's shoulders relaxed. I get off in 20 minutes, he said quietly. "Perfect," Keanu replied. "Just enough time for me to tell you about this character I'm working on. He's someone who learns that the strongest walls aren't the ones we face, they're the ones we build ourselves." As they walked toward the coffee kiosk, Keanu gestured for Marcus to handle the flight delay. The small crowd began to disperse, but their phones had captured something rare and precious, not just a celebrity handling discrimination, but a masterclass in transforming an enemy into a student, and a student into a friend. In the next half hour, the private terminal of LAX would witness something few had seen before: a Hollywood star and a security guard, sharing coffee and script pages, proving that sometimes the best way to break down barriers is to build bridges instead. The next morning, Davidson arrived at work to find his phone buzzing with notifications. The videos from the previous day had spread across social media, but not in the way anyone might have expected. There was no outrage, no calls for firing or public shaming. Instead, post after post praised the incredible transformation they had witnessed, not just in Davidson, but in how people viewed conflict resolution. The most viral clip wasn't of the initial confrontation, but of what happened after: Keanu and Davidson sitting at the small airport cafe, heads bent over a script, the security guard's face animated as he read lines with someone had tried to turn away just 30 minutes earlier. The hashtag #KindnessAndKeanu was trending. "I never thought I'd be reading lines with John Wick," Davidson had laughed during their conversation, the earlier tension completely dissolved. "John Wick solves problems with guns," Keanu had replied thoughtfully. "But in real life, the best weapon against hate is understanding." As Davidson started his morning shift, his supervisor called him into the office. His heart raced, expecting the worst. Instead, he found the head of airport security waiting with an unexpected proposal. They wanted him to help develop a new training program focusing on cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. Meanwhile, across town, Keanu sat in his living room with Marcus, reviewing the messages that had flooded in. There were interview requests from major networks, calls from civil rights organizations, and, most meaningfully, emails from Asian Americans sharing their own stories of similar experiences. "They want you to make a statement," Marcus said, scrolling through his tablet. "Everyone's asking how you stayed so calm, why you chose to handle it that way." Keanu set down his morning tea, considering. "You know what's interesting?" he said finally. "Everyone's focusing on how I handled it, but the real story is what happened after." Davidson didn't just apologize, he chose to learn, to change. That's the harder part. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from Davidson. "Thank you for yesterday. My daughter saw the video. She said it's the first time she's been proud to tell her friends what her dad does for a living." Keanu smiled, remembering their conversation over coffee. Davidson had opened up about growing up in a small town, how his worldview had been shaped by limited exposure to diversity, and how working at the airport had slowly begun to challenge his preconceptions. Yesterday's interaction hadn't just been about one moment of prejudice, it had been about breaking a cycle that had spanned generations. As Keanu prepared for his rescheduled flight to Vancouver, news channels were already picking up the story. But they weren't running with the usual celebrity confrontation angle. Instead, they were focusing on something more profound: how a moment of potential conflict had been transformed into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The LAX private terminal felt different that morning. The same sun streamed through the same windows, but the energy had shifted. Workers smiled and nodded at each other with more awareness, more intention. Davidson, standing at his post, now greeted each passenger with a new perspective, his interaction with Keanu having opened his eyes to the stories that existed behind every face. And somewhere in the city, a young Asian American child watched the viral video of Keanu and Davidson reading script lines together, learning that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't fighting back, it's fighting for understanding. 2 weeks after the LAX incident, Keanu sat in his Vancouver trailer between takes, reviewing an email from Davidson. The security guard had just finished his first cultural sensitivity training session, not as a participant, but as a co-facilitator. His personal story of transformation had become a powerful teaching tool. The participants actually listened, Davidson wrote. They saw themselves in my story. It's different when it comes from someone who's been on both sides. Keanu's response was simple: change happens one conversation at a time. The story had taken on a life of its own. Other airports had begun reaching out to LAX, interested in implementing similar training programs. But what touched Keanu most were the messages from fans sharing their own experiences of choosing compassion over confrontation. During breaks between filming, he worked with his team to establish a small foundation focused on promoting cultural understanding through storytelling. The first initiative? A series of workshops bringing together people from different backgrounds to share their stories, inspired by that moment of script reading in an airport cafe. Davidson had become an unexpected ally in this mission. His journey from prejudice to awareness was proving more impactful than any celebrity PSA could have been. It's harder to hate up close, he told a local news station. Sometimes you just need someone to give you a chance to see things differently. As Keanu prepared for his next scene, he thought about how a moment that could have ended in anger had instead sparked a movement of understanding. Sometimes the most powerful scenes in life, he realized, happened when the cameras weren't supposed to be rolling at all. 1 month after the incident, Keanu received an unexpected invitation. The Airport Security Officers Association wanted him to be the keynote speaker at their annual conference. The topic? Transforming confrontation into connection. Standing at the podium, Keanu looked out at the sea of uniforms. Davidson sat in the front row, now proudly wearing a new badge that identified him as a cultural understanding ambassador. We're all guilty of making snap judgments, Keanu began, his voice carrying its characteristic gentle authority. But what matters isn't our first thought, it's our next action. Every moment of prejudice carries the potential for transformation if we're brave enough to choose understanding over anger. The speech wasn't long, but its impact was profound. By the end of the conference, 12 major airports had committed to implementing the LAX model of cultural sensitivity training. Davidson's program, now formally called Breaking Barriers, would serve as the template. Later that evening, over dinner with Davidson and other security officers, Keanu listened as they shared their own stories of prejudice and learning. One officer spoke about how the viral video had changed how she approached her job. Another admitted to recognizing his own biases for the first time. You know what's amazing? Davidson said, turning to Keanu. A month ago, I was the problem. Now I'm part of the solution. All because you chose to see me as someone who could change. 1 year after the viral incident, Keanu sat in his home office, reviewing applications for the first class of Reeves-Davidson scholars. 20 promising students from diverse backgrounds would soon begin their journey in aviation security, each carrying the mission of combining safety with understanding. The Breaking Barriers program had now been implemented at over 50 airports worldwide. Davidson had just returned from Singapore, where he had helped launch the international version of the training program. His transformation from a security guard with prejudices to a global ambassador for change had inspired countless others. Sometimes the biggest journeys start with a moment of being lost, Davidson had told a graduating class of security officers. Keanu showed me that finding your way isn't about proving you're right, it's about being open to a new direction. As Keanu prepared for his next film role, he kept a photo on his desk, him and Davidson at the training center opening, both smiling, standing as equals. It served as a reminder that the most important roles we play aren't on screen, they're in those crucial moments when we choose what kind of world we want to create. On the anniversary of that fateful day at LAX, Keanu made a special trip to the private terminal. As he walked through security, he noticed something remarkable. Every officer wore the Cultural Understanding Ambassador pin, a small but powerful symbol of how far they'd come. Davidson was there to greet him, no longer just a security guard, but a man who had found his true calling in teaching others about transformation. Together, they walked to the spot where their story began. "You know what I learned from you that day?" Davidson said, looking at the understanding as a gateway sign they'd passed. "It's not about who has the power to hurt or help. It's about who has the courage to break the cycle." Keanu nodded, remembering that moment of choice. Every day, we all face moments where we can choose hatred or understanding, conflict or connection. The real power lies in making that choice consciously. The private terminal had become more than just a gateway for flights, it was now a symbol of how a single moment of compassion could transform lives. The Reeves-Davidson scholars were proving this daily, bringing new perspectives to aviation security across the country. Sometimes, Keanu reflected, the most heroic thing we can do is to see the humanity in someone who doesn't see it in us. As they stood there, a young Asian American officer approached them, her Cultural Understanding Ambassador pin gleaming. "You two showed us that change isn't just possible, it's a choice we can make every day," she said. "That's the real superpower." And in that moment, in the same spot where prejudice had once threatened to divide, understanding had built an unshakable bridge. It proved that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, they're about those quiet moments when we choose to transform an enemy into a friend, fear into understanding, and hatred into hope. This story reminds us that we all have the power to change the world, one interaction at a time. If this message of transformation and hope resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Your support helps us spread the message of compassion and understanding the world needs.